one of the biggest decisions that's being made right now is the proposal to build a swimming beach at the north end of Onondaga Lake. The county is Onondaga County is spending $440,000 of state money to do a feasibility study whose ultimate ends will be a site selection. They've already chosen that, Willow Bay, shovel-ready design, and model contracts. And a lot of us were very concerned about the process that we saw being used to communicate with the public about this. So we decided to do two things tonight. First, to gather some people who share the values that I mentioned, some of them closely affiliated with a better future for Onondaga Lake, some of them not, but definitely people who share our beliefs in a lot of ways and have information that we want to share. And then we would like to open it up to have a discussion, to hear what people have to say. Seriously, pro, con, there really hasn't been an opportunity that we have seen for people to listen to one another, to have these kinds of discussions in public. First, I would like to introduce our panelists. We have Alma Lowry, an environmental attorney of counsel to the Law Office of Joe Heath, General Counsel for the Onondaga Nation. We have Mariana Kaufman, physician, activist, and parent. And we have Lindsay Spear, Director of Creating Change Consulting, who has been working on these issues, following these issues, and involved in them for 10 years? Yeah, at least. 10 years at least. So we'll just go into our panel, and I will just sit down and listen like everyone else will, and at the end, we will come back together and see if we can share our ideas.
I'm going to try to compress about 8 or 9 years worth of knowledge about the Superfund site on the lake into the next 7 or 8 minutes. Do we have a slide person? There you go. So I'm going to talk kind of quickly and condense things down, but I wanted to give you a sense of what's in the lake, what's around the lake, and why the lake became a Superfund site. So there's our view of the lake. It is now the site of parks and trails and shopping. It used to be the site of a lot of industrial plants and facilities. Between about 1881 and 1896, Honeywell and its predecessor companies operated several industrial facilities around the lake. There were other industries that were sited around the lake. All of those industries that made things like caustic soda and soda ash and benzene, toluene, ethylene, xylene, chlorinated benzenes, chloralkali, they all created a lot of waste. Those wastes include mercury, chromium, and other metals, scimitar wastes, BTEX compounds, and the wastes that were generated from that, the benzene, the toluene, ethylene, and xylene, chlorinated benzenes, naphthalene, other polyaromatic hydrocarbons, PCBs, and dioxins. So a whole range of wastes. Joe Heath is fond of talking about the 26 contaminants at the bottom of the lake. So all kinds of contaminants were generated. And they generated a lot of them. Next slide, please. So the solvay process in and of itself, that was a particularly wasteful process. It generated 1.5 pounds of waste for every pound of product that it generated. And it dumped the waste into the solvay waste beds, which you can see go back please. The solvay waste beds, which you can see all around the lake, about 1/3 of the lake is green with these waste beds. And while solvay wastes are relatively benign, you should also be aware that when there were open waste beds, sorry if you can remember that slide that was previously, all of those open waste beds, whenever they were open and how Honeywell or Allied had extra waste that they needed to get rid of, they would dump it in those waste beds, which is why we find what are called co-disposed industrial wastes, chlorinated benzenes, BTEX compounds, PCBs, other kinds of industrial waste, scattered throughout what are meant to be simply solvay waste beds. Waste beds 1 through 8, waste bed B, Harbor Brook, Murphy's Island. So there are industrial wastes in all of those sites that could potentially leak into the lake. And between about 1946 and 1970, Allied created mercury as part of its chloralkali production process, and it dumped about 20 to 25 pounds of mercury waste into the lake every day, about 165,000 pounds in total. And just for reference, the Metro sewage treatment plant right now under its permit and all of the effluent that it dumps every day can emit 0.07 pounds of mercury. Allied was dumping 25 pounds a day, as opposed to 0.07 pounds. Huge amount of mercury. As a result, in 1970, fish were declared unfit to eat because of the high mercury contamination. In 1989, New York sued Honeywell for its pollution of Onondaga Lake. In 1994, the federal government joined that lawsuit, declaring Onondaga Lake and the areas around it, as you can see, a Superfund site. And what they had to do next, once EPA joined this fight and declared the lake and its surroundings and surrounding areas a Superfund site, they had to determine the scope of that Superfund site. And what you can see up here are all of the waste sites that are considered subsites of the Onondaga Lake Superfund site. All of those locations up on that map are areas that had waste dumped into them and that were designed in such a way that waste could or did leach from those facilities, from those waste beds into the lake. Most, but not all of those, 12 subsites are owned by or connected to Allied and Honeywell. And as I said, all of them, by definition, by their inclusion in the Superfund site, were leaching or potentially leaching contaminants into the lake. So once the Superfund process starts, works like this. If we know who is responsible, if there's agreement on who's responsible, then that party is required to do a number of assessments around the lake. You start with a remedial investigation. If you could move forward, please. You start with a remedial investigation to define the scope and intensity of pollution. Then you do a feasibility study to figure out what the potential solutions are and evaluate them, compare them to each other. Then you develop a proposed plan, a record of decision, which sets out to describe the remedy, remedial goals, and timelines. So what you're seeing up here is a map from the remedial investigation. It shows where we had contaminants of concern, basically. Everywhere that's yellow in the lake, in the sediments, there was at least one contaminant of concern that exceeded levels of concern. All places red, we had 2 or more contaminants that exceeded the safe levels, the levels of concern that the DEC had set. So you can see that most of the lake was contaminated. And in fact, that's what they found. The remedial investigation found that for the lake, there were some residual contaminants in the water. Most of them had settled out by that point, by the time of the investigation in 2002, into the sediments. The contaminants in the water was mostly mercury. That remained in the water column. Most of the other contaminants, again, had settled into the sediments. And there was a whole lot of contamination in the sediments. A lot, some throughout the lake, but heavily contaminated in that southern end of the lake. And what has now been done, when we're talking just about the lake bottom, in terms of once we've assessed where the contamination is, the next thing is to plan the remediation. Remediation in this case has pretty much 3 components. One is trying to keep new contaminants out of the lake. So the DEC did that, or the DEC required the installation of things to cut off onshore contaminant sources, all of those waste beds and things that ring the lake that had contaminants in them and continue to have contaminants in them to this day. Those have been, the DEC has tried to cut those off as sources of contamination by installing a barrier wall and a groundwater containment system. The idea being that they're going to keep the contaminants that remain in those wastes from leaching into the lake by those methods. And also, the second way of keeping contaminants out of the water column is by adding nitrate to the very deepest areas in the lake, with the idea being that that nitrate will prevent mercury, which remains buried in the sediments at the bottom of the lake, that hasn't been removed, from methylating and then moving into the water column. Methyl mercury is lighter. It would tend to move through the sediments and into the water column. The second thing that they did was monitored natural attenuation for the deep areas, which basically means that they are going to sit and watch while the creeks dump sediment into the lake bottom, and that will cover some part of the lake bottom, about 4 centimeters is what the hope is. And the last part, and this is what Honeywell usually talks about when they talk about remediation, is dredge and fill, right? So dredge and capping. So about 2.2 million cubic yards, in this area, about 2.2 million cubic yards has been removed from the areas that are shown here in orange, and a cap of between 12 and 24 inches has been placed in most of those areas, not all. Two things to keep in mind. One, the depth of dredging was really based primarily on what would be required to place a cap and not lose lake depth, not based on the contamination levels of the materials underneath the cap. So some very toxic materials remain underneath the cap because that's not what drove the dredging. It was making sure that we had enough depth to boat over the top of it. And the other thing is that the cap is not the same thickness throughout. The general cap is 12 to 24 inches. There are many areas where it's thinner. As we're moving down towards the profundal zone, about maybe 12 inches. And there are also about 30 acres within that site where there's no cap at all, or a very, very thin cap, maybe 4 inches, because the sediments were just not strong enough to hold the weight of the thick cap that was originally proposed, or because there were structures in place that made the area unstable. And the goal of this cap is both to separate the contaminated sediments from sediment-dwelling animals, like benthic invertebrate and the like, and to keep contaminants from migrating back up through the cap in groundwater, as groundwater moves up through the cap, because this is a lake, right? And it's connected to the groundwater. Groundwater typically moves upwards from below the lake, often into the lake itself. In this case, it would be carrying contaminants. Remember that between 10 and 18 million cubic yards of contaminated sediments, with all of those things that I listed before, the mercury, the PCBs, the dioxins, the rest of it, remain below this cap. And if we don't keep the groundwater from migrating up through the cap, it's going to carry contaminants back into the lake, right? And that's being controlled both by the cap and by some of those measures to keep groundwater from moving back into the lake, the barrier wall and the groundwater collection systems. So Honeywell has said that they're basically done with remediation, right? They've dredged and they've capped and they're done, and the lake is ready to be used again. But I think the point that I want to make sure that I leave you with right now is that we're not done. The remediation of Onondaga Lake is really the containment of materials that remain at the bottom of the lake, remain toxic, and could potentially move back into the water column, back into the surface sediments, if this system is unsuccessful. Honeywell has designed its cap according to its proposals to last for 1,000 years. That's not just them being funny or them being generous. That's them recognizing that the contaminants that last on the bottom of the lake are going to be toxic for 1,000 years. And Honeywell, or someone, is going to have to pay attention to that cap for 1,000 years. DEC itself has estimated the degradation time. There are contaminants in groundwater, both on some of the onshore sites and outside of the barrier wall. DEC has estimated that there's no additional contamination to that groundwater, no contaminants leach in from the soils, the contaminated soils. Those groundwaters would degrade to the point of being safe somewhere between about 43 and 750 years.
So the key piece that I want to really start us thinking about is about relationship with Onondaga Lake. This is a lake that we are just now recovering, we are just now healing from over 100 years of abuse. And human impact has been the key of that abuse. This is a time where we really need to be encouraging Onondaga Lake to be in its most natural state, to heal, to have the wildlife come back, to not be disturbed. And I can't think of a much more disturbing thing to put on a lake than a beach. So that's my first gut reaction to, is this what we should be doing right now? This lake still is healing. So if you go up to the north end of Onondaga Lake at Willow Bay at this point, there is kind of a beach area up there already. The geese love it. And you see, it kind of looks like white sand, but it's not white sand. It's these little pebbly, very lightweight pieces of material, and they're called oncolites. And what they are is actually calcium carbonate that has surrounded around, it actually is an interaction with cyanobacteria in the past. It basically is an indication of, so this is the quote. This comes out of the Onondaga Lake Record of Decision in 2005. It says, in Onondaga Lake, oncolite formation is closely associated with the discharges of calcium-laden wastes to the lake by Honeywell. So when I stand up there at the north end of the lake and I see the entire shoreline covered with these oncolites, what this tells me is that the waste moves in the lake.
This isn't rocket science. Anyone who knows a lake knows that things move around it. You don't put something in one part of the lake and not have it go to another part. And so this is evidence to me that we need to be looking at these sediments. So just to give people a sense of what the county is proposing, this is from their feasibility study. There's still ongoing feasibility study. There's very little documentation actually out there. This is on their website. And you look up at the very north end there and see 1A, 1B. Those are the beaches that they're talking about in Willow Bay. And I think they're settling more on 1A is my sense of things, but I'm not entirely sure. Next slide. So looking up at that north end, this goes back to a similar visual that Alma pointed out here last time. There has been no sediment sampling right along that portion of the lakeshore, the littoral zone. The closest one you've got is P113. And they found in that location, they found this list of contaminants. None of these exceeded the cleanup criteria at the time. And so they said that this was fine. Next slide. And so you also have, so we've got metals and we've got SVOCs. And they basically said, okay, so that point, that one point is adequate for these things. We don't need to test up closer to the outlet. Next slide. Oh, that's metals. Excellent. I'm going to pass this little bag around. These are the oncolytes. I want everyone to have a visual of those so that when you go to the lakeshore, you know what you're looking at. So those are the metals. Again, so there's mercury there, there's chromium, calcium, cadmium, but they didn't come to the point where it required remediation. Next slide. But just over here, just a little ways down, there was a hot spot. And from the cadmium and the mercury, particularly the mercury concentrations, they decided that one spot needed remediation. Next slide. Great, go back for one if you can.
What is the number of that? Yeah, go back.
If everyone wants a copy of my slides, I'll happily share them.
Thank you.
And so you can see this little tiny dot way up there, way away from everything else. Well, they did end up putting a little cap on top of that one hot spot. And they sampled a little bit around it, and they found that, okay, they didn't have exceedances around it. But again, this talks to me about the hotspots that do occur. And so I personally do not feel confident that there's been enough sampling at the north end of the lake to know what's in those sediments and to know that what's being proposed for a beach will keep us safe. What's really frustrating is I've been raising this issue since the time the beach discussion started. I've continually asked the county, are you going to do more sediment testing as you're doing this feasibility study? As far as I can get an answer out of them, the answer is no. I've gone to the DEC, I've gone to Honeywell, I've shown them this map, and I said, can you show me any further data that shows what's in the sediments of the north end of the lake? Is there any more sampling? And the answer is no. Next slide. So there you can see, those are the extent of the sediment sampling up there. And so you think about when you're going to a beach, what are you doing? You're wading out through the sediments into the lake. They are planning on putting down sand. That's nice, that's good. Sand gets churned up. The lake gets churned up. What's moving in from the areas around it immediately?
I've been an activist in the area for about 5 years. Sometimes I focus a lot on public health issues. I'm also a physician. And when Rochelle was talking with me about this group, I became really interested in it. This photo was taken this summer in June. This was a press conference that we held outside of the second out of 3 meetings that the county held that were supposed public forums. Several of us called to find out the format of the public forum, and we're told that we cannot say anything out loud to where anyone else could hear it. and we had to go to tables and speak only one-on-one with their experts in a format, and we could write down questions. Some of us did write down questions on little cards and never got a phone call with any answers after the forum. The second forum was also held in a very inaccessible location in the Lakeview Amphitheater, where no bus lines go. I did go, and several of us went, but we did not have any real attendance for our press conference because it was so out of the way, and there is not one person that can walk to the Lakeview Amphitheater. There are no houses there. So we drove, and I went through several gates where there were security guards waving me in to this VIP room upstairs at the Lakeview Amphitheater, where there were more county people with name badges than there were people in attendance. Our attendance tonight is much, much larger than the attendance they had. And we were told, even though we persisted in trying to ask questions so that other people could hear us, over and over again we were reminded that we weren't supposed to be talking out loud. This is more of the same of what you heard before from Alma and Lindsay. This is starting in 1884 to 1969, all of the pollution that has been dumped for almost 100 years liberally. So in 2017, the World Health Organization estimated that 40% of global deaths were due to pollution. 40% of global deaths, meaning that other countries might have even worse as far as liberal pollution, smog, related to indoor air quality from cooking. And we don't think that here in the U.S. or maybe that we would be going down this risky venture that would put people at risk from polluted contaminants that would put us all at such health risk. So next slide. But we actually know that there is harm already being done to a population that is eating fish from Onondaga Lake. This is talking about the human health risk from mercury. The high levels of mercury have been found in Onondaga Lake fish. And mercury is a heavy metal, and mercury, cadmium, and chromium have all been found in the lake and in the sediment, and they are all so toxic to human health that really any amount is not considered to be a safe thing. But right now we have people that are fishing from the lake and eating the fish, and already the signs that are around the lake are not sufficient so that refugee communities know enough about them not to eat a certain amount of fish. And so pregnant women, young children would be most at risk. I want to point to two studies today. This one is the biomonitoring of Great Lakes populations, and what they did is that this is a study that launched in 2013, and the study looked at 3 populations of communities that were fishing from the lake: Syracuse anglers, Burmese refugees, and Bhutanese refugee community. Out of all 3 of these communities, the Burmese were the ones that were fishing from Onondaga Lake the most. A much larger percentage of the fish they were eating came from Onondaga Lake, 47%. Next slide. And so that's a little bit about 70% of households had children under 15 that were eating the fish as well, which is concerning. Next slide. And so groups were compared, and what we also did is we measured mercury and cadmium and lead taken from the blood and urine of all three of these groups. The only group that had such elevated levels of mercury and lead out of the three groups that exceeded what was considered safe limits and were required by the study to have follow-up counseling, asking them not to eat so much fish from the lake, were the Burmese. So this is public. All of these data points came from 2015, 2016. This is relatively recent. And so as far as we know, there's still a major health concern of elevated levels of mercury. Okay, so we know that we need to be careful about how much fish we eat and from where we fish it from, and fish can concentrate mercury, and that it's really important for pregnant women to be especially careful, because if they ingest too much, and the child can be born with low IQ and all sorts of other problems. However, another way of exposure to mercury is through the soil. Elevated levels of mercury from the soil can be, you can have direct exposure straight from the skin. But another way, how many people here have ever seen an infant or toddler eat dirt? Okay, right. So here we are with sediment that's known to have mercury. We're putting infants and children going into the water that are often going to put dirt or soil in their mouths. This is from the Emory, the previous one, the Emory Pediatrics, which has a really good public health, and they're the ones that had the soil on there.